I spend my days fixing broken memories for other people. In my studio in Seattle, surrounded by the hum of vintage projectors and the faint acidic scent of developing chemicals, I've learned that images lie. People smile in photographs while their worlds are burning down. I can adjust the contrast, I can remove the scratches, and I can make a moment from 1950 look like it happened yesterday, but I can't fix the truth behind the frame. I thought I was an expert at seeing what stayed hidden in the shadows, but it turns out I was blind to the person sharing my own bed for 7 years. Juno was my grounding wire. She was an art consultant, or so she told me, with a taste for mid-century modern furniture and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. We had this life that felt curated like a high-end gallery exhibit. A loft in Capitol Hill Sunday mornings, at the local farmer's market, and a deep, unspoken trust that I banked my entire existence on. Her job required travel. She was always scouting for rare finds in the Southwest, specifically Arizona. I never questioned it. Why would I? When she came home, she smelled like desert sage and brought back stories of dusty roadside shops and eccentric collectors. I loved her more for her passion, for the way her eyes lit up when she talked about a find. The cracks didn't start with a scream or a dramatic confession. They started with a vintage Leica M3 camera she bought me for our anniversary. A few weeks ago, while Juno was supposedly on a scouting trip near Sedona, I sat down at my workbench to strip the camera down. I was looking for a mechanical snag, but what I found was a small leather-bound case tucked into the hidden lining of the camera bag. Inside wasn't a spare lens or a roll of film. It was a second driver's license. I stared at it under my magnifying lamp. The face was undeniably my wife's, but the name printed in bold letters was Sutton Reed. The address wasn't our loft in Seattle. It was a residential street in a town called Copper Ridge, Arizona. I checked the date of birth. It was hers. Everything was hers except the life she belonged to. I didn't call her. Instead, I did what I do best. I started restoring the image. I dug into our digital life using the skills I'd picked up from years of forensic photo recovery. I found a secondary encrypted cloud account linked to an email address I'd never seen. When I finally cracked the password, which was the name of a dog, we never had the screen flooded with photos that felt like physical blows to my face. There was Juno, but she wasn't the sophisticated Seattle art consultant I knew. In these photos, she was wearing flannel shirts and work boots. She was standing in front of a modest, sun-baked ranch house with a wraparound porch, and she wasn't alone. In every third photo, there was a man. Ridge Miller. But the photo that broke me, the one that made me physically ill, was a picture of Juno or Sutton sitting in a rocking chair on that porch. She was holding a toddler, a little boy with a shock of blonde hair and eyes that were a mirror image of hers. The caption on the digital album was, "Zion's first birthday." I stayed in my studio for 48 hours straight. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just stared at the screen, watching the reel of a life I didn't belong to. In Seattle, we were the power couple who didn't want kids. In Arizona, she was a mother. She was a wife to a man who probably thought he was the luckiest guy in the world. She had partitioned her soul into 2 different states, and I was just the northern half of a lie. I waited until the day she was scheduled to fly back to Seattle. I acted like the man she expected to see. When she walked through the door smelling of that familiar desert sage, I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the kitchen counter to stay upright. She kissed me, her lips warm and deceptive, and told me about a boring meeting in Phoenix. "I missed you, Koa," she whispered. I realized then that I didn't know this woman at all. I was married to a ghost. The next time she left for a trip 3 days later, I waited an hour, packed a single bag, and drove to SeaTac Airport. I booked a flight to Phoenix under my middle name. I rented a nondescript silver sedan and drove north toward the mountains. Copper Ridge wasn't a tourist town. It was a place for people who wanted to be left alone. I found the address from the license. I parked the rental car a quarter-mile down the road and walked the rest of the way on foot. I crouched behind a low stone wall at the edge of the property. The house was exactly as it appeared in the photos, but seeing it in 3 dimensions made it devastatingly real. There was a tricycle overturned in the yard. Then the front door opened. Juno stepped out. But it wasn't my Juno. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was wearing a faded denim apron. She looked relaxed in a way I had never seen in Seattle. A moment later, the man from the photo's ridge walked out behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back, laughing at something he said, a sound that I had always thought belonged only to me. Then came the boy, Zion. He came running out of the house, clutching a wooden toy truck, and shouted, "Mommy, Mommy, look!" She dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide. The way she gathered that child to her chest, it was a raw, primal love that didn't fit into our curated Seattle life. I stood there in the deepening shadows, a stranger trespassing on the holy ground of my own betrayal. I reached into my bag and pulled out my own camera. I didn't take a photo for art. I took it as evidence of the execution. I watched through the lens as Ridge leaned down to kiss her, his hand resting on the back of her neck with a terrifyingly casual intimacy. The lights inside the ranch house flickered on, warm and inviting, casting a golden glow onto the porch. From my spot in the dark, I watched them retreat inside. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the quiet canyon like a gavel hitting a block. I stayed there for a long time. Everything about this scene was peaceful, wholesome, and utterly poisonous. I reached down and picked up a small jagged stone from the ground, squeezing it until the sharp edges pressed deep into my palm. I stood there until the lights in the house began to go out one by one, leaving me in total darkness. I finally turned away. When I reached the rental car, I leaned against the hood, looking back toward the faint silhouette of the ranch, and felt a strange, hollow clarity settle over me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the messaging app and saw a text from Juno from 3 hours ago. "Thinking of you, Koa. Can't wait to get back to our quiet loft. I love you." I stared at the words until they blurred. I didn't reply. I sat in the silence of the cabin for a long time before finally reaching for the ignition. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing, feeling the shift from the man who had been destroyed to the man who was about to become the destroyer. The engine finally turned over, a low growl that felt like it was vibrating through my very marrow, echoing the tectonic shift happening inside my soul. I drove away from that ranch house without turning on my headlights, navigating by the pale, ghostly glow of the desert moon until I hit the main road. My hands were fused to the steering wheel, my grip so tight that my fingers had gone numb, yet I felt every jagged vibration of the gravel beneath the tires. I wasn't just driving back to a hotel. I was exiting the life of the man who believed in us and entering the cold, calculated headspace of a man who was now a ghost in his own story. By the time I reached the fluorescent sterility of my motel room in Sedona, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the red rocks in shades of violent crimson. I didn't go to bed. I couldn't. Instead, I transformed the small, rickety desk into a tactical command center. I laid out my camera, the digital memory cards, and the second driver's license. I stared at the name Sutton Reed until the letters started to swim. In Seattle, Juno was the woman who appreciated the grain in a 35mm film and the nuance of a silent film restoration. Here, Sutton was the woman who probably knew the best place to buy hay and the exact time the school bus dropped off her son. I spent the next 48 hours living in the shadows of Copper Ridge. I became a phantom. I watched her from a distance through the long lens of my camera as she ran errands at the local hardware store and chatted with neighbors at a roadside cafe. She was seamless. There wasn't a flicker of guilt on her face, not a single moment where she looked over her shoulder as if expecting the ghost of her real life to be standing there. I watched Ridge too. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to see a monster, someone who had stolen my wife, but all I saw was a man who was being devoured by a lie he didn't even know existed. We were both being bled dry by the same vampire. Back in the motel, I began the digital freezing process. My background in data recovery gave me an edge she couldn't have anticipated. I discovered that for 3 years, Juno had been inflating the costs of her art scouting trips, skimming off the top of our joint high-yield savings to fund the Reed household. She wasn't just cheating. She was embezzling our future to pay for a life I never consented to. I contacted Hollis, an old friend from my college days who now worked in the belly of the state's administrative records. "Koa, this is messy," Hollis told me. "This Sutton Reed identity, it's not just a fake ID. She didn't just stumble into this man, she built a fortress." The realization hit me like a physical blow. 6 years. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was a long con. Every "I love you" she whispered into my ear was a calculated move to keep the machine running. I began to gaslight the lie. It was subtle at first. I flew back to Seattle a day before she did, ensuring the loft looked exactly as it always did. When she arrived, I greeted her with a glass of wine and a smile that felt like a mask made of cooling lead. "How was the hunt?" I asked. "Exhausting," she sighed. "I'm just glad to be home with you, Koa." I watched her sip the wine and felt a surge of adrenaline. I started leaving breadcrumbs. I'd leave a brochure for a real estate agency in Arizona on the kitchen island. I wanted to see her flinch. But she was a master. She would look at the brochure, toss it in the recycling bin without a word, and ask me what I wanted for dinner. To truly destroy a woman who lived in 2 dimensions, I had to force those dimensions to occupy the same space at the same time. I spent the next week in Seattle acting like the perfect, oblivious husband, all while I was systematically dismantling the bridge behind her. I moved our shared investments into a trust. I filed paperwork to restructure our loft's mortgage under a holding company I controlled. I was essentially turning her into a tenant in her own life, but she was too busy managing her secret schedules to notice. I began to monitor her secret communications more aggressively. Every night I watched her type letters to Ridge. She called him her real life. That was the phrase that broke the last dam of my mercy. I was the film restorer, and it was time to bring the hidden layers to the surface. I started planning the anniversary gala. I booked a gallery space known for its immersive projections. I didn't just invite our Seattle circle. I used the information I'd gathered from Copper Ridge to find Ridge's contact information. I created a fake corporate persona and reached out to him. "She says it sounds like a great opportunity," Ridge said, returning to the phone. "Count us in." A surprise. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. As the date approached, I became a master of logistics. In reality, I was at the gallery, but I wasn't just setting up projectors for art. I was building a trap. I was editing a very specific sequence of film, a combination of our wedding videos, her scouting trips, and the secret footage I had captured in Copper Ridge. The night before the gala, she came home from her trip. "Tomorrow is going to change everything," I whispered into her hair. "I know," she replied. "I'm so proud of you, Koa." I walked over to the vintage Leica she had given me, picked it up and clicked the shutter. The sound was a sharp mechanical snap that cut through the silence of the loft like a breaking bone. I stood there motionless as the clock on the wall ticked toward the morning, each second a rhythmic countdown, to the moment the two halves of a lie would finally violently become one. The gala arrived with a cold Seattle drizzle that blurred the city lights into a smear of neon and slate. Inside the gallery, however, the atmosphere was sterile and sharp. I stood in the center of the room, watching the black tie guests filter in like characters in a play I had written but hadn't yet finished. The space was a cathedral of high-tech projection. White walls 30 feet high, designed to swallow a person whole in whatever imagery I chose to cast upon them. Juno was breathtaking. She wore a floor-length emerald gown, her hair swept up in a sophisticated chignon. She had no idea that while she was playing the role of the devoted wife, the man she had called her real life in Arizona was currently sitting in a black SUV only 3 blocks away, clutching a VIP invitation to a ceremony that didn't exist. I had timed the arrivals with the precision of a master clockmaker. I had a secondary team ensure that Ridge Miller and his son were ushered into the private VIP lounge upstairs until the exact moment the presentation began. I had told Ridge that the Rural Builders Award was a surprise segment of the evening, and that he needed to stay hidden to maintain the emotional impact. He had agreed, his voice thick with the humble excitement of a man who rarely stepped out of his small town. Around 9 p.m., the house lights began to dim. I walked toward the podium, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice amplified by the hidden speakers. "Tonight is about the things we keep and the things we try to bury. In my work, I find that the most beautiful images are often the ones that have been hidden under layers of dust and neglect. But sometimes when you peel back those layers, you find something you never expected." I signaled the technician. The walls erupted into life. The first sequence was beautiful. It was a montage of my life with Juno. Our wedding in the San Juan Islands, our travels to Paris, Tokyo, London. I saw Juno smile, her eyes glistening. She probably thought this was my tribute to her. We think we know the people we love. I continued, my voice dropping an octave. But film is a strange medium. It can capture the shadows that move when we aren't looking. The music shifted. The piano notes became discordant. The images on the walls began to flicker. The scenes of Seattle were slowly overwritten by a new set of images. Dusty Arizona roads. The jagged silhouette of the Superstition Mountains. A small, sun-baked ranch house. I saw Juno's posture change instantly. The projections weren't just photos anymore. They were high-definition videos I had captured. There she was on the screen, 40 feet tall, wearing a flannel shirt, laughing with a little boy. "This is Sutton," I said, the name hitting the room like a gunshot. "She's a mother. She's a woman who knows the exact rhythm of a small town in Arizona." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I displayed the marriage certificate from Arizona next to our own. I showed the bank transfers, the skimming of our Seattle life to pay for the Reed mortgage. "Koa, stop this," Juno whispered. "I'm not finished," I said. "I wanted to make sure the two halves of your life finally met." I looked toward the balcony. The security guard opened the double doors. Ridge Miller walked out holding Zion's hand. They stood at the railing looking down into the sea of black ties. Ridge looked confused, squinting against the bright projections of his own home. Sutton Ridge called out, his voice cracking the silence of the gallery. The moment was a car crash in slow motion. Zion broke free from Ridge's grip and ran toward the stairs, his small voice echoing. "Mommy, mommy, look at the big pictures." The emerald gown didn't matter anymore. Ridge descended the stairs, his face shifting to a horrific realization. "What is this, Sutton? Why are you wearing that? Who are these people?" Juno opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The curated life had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. "Her name isn't Sutton Ridge," I said, stepping down from the podium. "She's been haunting my life for 7 years, and I imagine she's been haunting yours for just as long." I watched as the two worlds collided. Ridge pulled the boy away from her. His eyes locked on Juno with a look of profound betrayal. "You did this," she hissed at me, the saintly mask finally slipping. "You ruined everything." "I didn't ruin it, Juno," I replied. "I just adjusted the exposure." I walked toward the back of the gallery, leaving her in the center of the wreckage. I reached the heavy steel doors and pushed them open. The Seattle rain was still falling. I got into my car and sat in the darkness, the only sound the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof. I started the engine and began to drive away, leaving the emerald dress and the ranch house to burn together in the dark. The city lights moved past my windshield in long, distorted streaks of amber and white like a film reel, melting under the heat of a projector lamp. I didn't have a destination. I just needed the motion. The silence in the car was heavy, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos I had left behind at the gallery. For 7 years, my life had been a series of meticulously planned frames, but as I drove through the damp Seattle streets, I realized I was finally off the script. I was no longer the husband, the victim, or the curator. I was just a man breathing air that didn't taste like a lie. I pulled over at a lookout point overlooking the Puget Sound. The water was a vast obsidian mirror reflecting nothing but the void. I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, and finally let the adrenaline drain out of me. My hands, which had been steady enough to dismantle a Leica and orchestrate a public execution, finally began to shake. It wasn't regret. It was the terrifying vibration of total emptiness. I picked up my phone. It was blowing up with notifications, but there was one message that stood out. It was a video file sent from the gallery's internal security system. I hit play. The video showed the aftermath after I had walked out. The gala had turned into a wasteland. In the center of the room, under the flickering light of the Arizona ranch house still looping on the walls, stood Ridge and Juno. Ridge wasn't yelling anymore. He looked hollowed out, holding Zion close to his chest. He looked at Juno with a gaze that was colder than any revenge I could have devised. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply turned around and walked toward the exit, his heavy work boots echoing a final rhythmic goodbye on the concrete. Juno tried to follow him, her emerald dress trailing through the spilled champagne like a dying serpent. But she stopped at the door. She knew that the Sutton who baked bread and lived for the desert sun was dead, and the Juno who dominated the Seattle art scene was a social pariah. She was left standing in the wreckage of two worlds belonging to neither. I deleted the video. The restoration was complete. Over the next few weeks, the legal fallout was a surgical process. Because I had spent months moving our assets into a trust linked to her identity fraud, the divorce was less of a negotiation and more of a repossession. I met Ridge one last time a month later at a neutral diner halfway between Seattle and the airport. He was heading back to Arizona to pick up the pieces. He looked older, but there was a clarity in his expression. I sliding a thick envelope across the table. It contained the college fund I had set up for Zion, the only part of the money I felt shouldn't be returned to me. Ridge didn't touch the envelope at first. "You didn't drag me in, Koa," he said. I was already in the dark. "You just turned the lights on." It hurt like hell to see it, but I'd rather live in a painful truth than a comfortable grave. We didn't talk about her. As he walked away, I realized that we were the only two people in the world who truly understood the cost of her double life. I returned to my studio in Capitol Hill, but I didn't go back to restoring old films. I stripped the walls of the vintage posters and the curated furniture. I kept only the essentials. People often ask me if I went too far. They say that public humiliation is a scar that never heals, but they don't understand. When you are dealing with a master forger, you can't just fix the signature. You have to burn the canvas so that no one else can ever be fooled by the fake again. I sit here now looking at a blank wall and I feel a peace I haven't known in a decade. My life is no longer a high-definition production. It's grainy, it's unedited, and it's lonely. But it's mine. I've learned that the truth doesn't set you free the way the movies say it does. It sets you free by stripping you naked and leaving you in the cold. But at least you can feel the wind on your skin. I want to hear from you. Do you think I was a monster for involving Ridge and Zion in that public takedown? Or was it the only way to ensure she could never haunt another soul again? Where do you stand? Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one. And if you've ever survived a betrayal that felt like a demolition, share your story. We're all just trying to find the original print in a world of copies. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more about how I'm rebuilding from the ashes. I'll see you in the next one. Ari.